For centuries, the word Viking has summoned a singular, brutal image. Bearded warriors in horned helmets, faces smeared with dirt and blood, storming across medieval Europe with axes raised, leaving smoldering villages in their wake. The very mention of their name was enough to make kings tremble and monks pray for deliverance. But what if everything you thought you knew about Vikings was wrong? Into the truth of Viking society, who they really were, how they lived, what they believed, and how they still shape our world in ways you may never have imagined. What if the popular image handed down through movies, novels, and heavy metal album covers is less fact than Victorian fantasy, a warped reflection of medieval history shaped by modern fears, romanticism, and outright propaganda? Today, we peel back the myths. We'll journey beyond the of horned helmets and blood eagles, every Halloween costume. TV show and cartoon Viking seems to sport a grand helmet adorned with curling, menacing horns. During the height of Romanticism, European artists and opera composers sought to conjure visions of barbaric northern warriors. It was in 1876 when Richard Wagner staged his epic opera Der Ring des Nibelungen that costume designers gave his Viking characters horned helmets to make them appear more fearsome and otherworldly, a symbol of primal savagery, a marker of otherness. But here's the truth. No such helmets have ever been found. But in reality, the word Viking wasn't even an ethnic identity. It wasn't a tribe, a nation, or a race. It was an activity, not in Viking burial sites, not in ancient texts, not even as ceremonial artifacts. To go a Viking was to leave home and venture overseas, not a job title or way of life. They raised livestock, grew barley, and repaired boats. Their daily lives revolved not around conquest, but around survival. Raiding was a seasonal activity undertaken when the weather was fair and the harvest safely in, but a temporary pursuit. Much like how a soldier today might deploy overseas and then return to civilian life, let's begin with the most famous lie of them all, the horned helmet. It's an image burned into the collective imagination. The entire idea was invented in the 19th century. The world, it seems, never looked back. Real Viking helmets were simple, functional iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard, but never with horns. Those fancy decorations would have been a disaster in battle, easily snagged or caught. And speaking of ships, another myth demands correction. It's often assumed that all Vikings were seafaring raiders, endlessly pillaging the coasts of Britain, Francia, and beyond. In Old Norse referred to someone who went on expeditions, often to raid or trade. The vast majority of Scandinavians in the so-called Viking Age, which spanned roughly from the late 8th to early 11th centuries, were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders. Most Norsemen never lifted a sword in anger, and those who did were not the indiscriminately bloodthirsty maniacs that later Christian chroniclers portrayed. See, much of what we know about Viking brutality comes from their victims, monks and priests whose monasteries were burned, whose communities were looted. Their horror was genuine, but their words were colored by religious hatred and fear of pagan outsiders. To them, Vikings were not men but beasts, agents of Satan sent to punish Christendom for its sins. Yet when we examine Viking violence in context, it was little different from that of their Christian neighbors. The early medieval world was a savage place. Frankish kings slaughtered rebellious villages by the hundreds. Anglo-Saxon warbands raided one another with equal cruelty. Their boats were marvels of engineering, long and narrow, shallow drafted so they could slip up rivers and strike deep into the heartland. Viking merchants carried furs, iron, walrus ivory, and amber southward, returning with silk, silver, spices, and wine. A monastery thought safe 100 miles inland could fall overnight. Execution, mutilation, and terror tactics were the currency of power across all of Europe. But it stands as proof that the Vikings were not merely raiders. They were also bold navigators and settlers. The Viking raids were memorable because they were unexpected, because their attackers came from the sea vanishing before armies could gather. But even this portrayal of Vikings as ruthless pirates obscures another truth. Trade and conquest brought new bloodlines into Norse communities. Some Viking warriors were black or Asian. Their mythology, immortalized in the poetic Edda and sagas, was rich and complex, filled with gods who were flawed, mortal, and achingly human. Others were born of Irish or Scottish mothers captured in raids. These same men were also traders, explorers, settlers. They established sprawling trade routes that stretched from the cold waters of the North Atlantic to the opulent courts of Byzantium and the bustling markets of Baghdad. In fact, archaeologists have uncovered Viking burial sites containing Arabian coins, Chinese silk, and Byzantine glassware, testaments to their global reach, and they were explorers of remarkable daring. Long before Columbus or Magellan, Viking ships sailed beyond the known world. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, reached the shores of what is now Newfoundland around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus set foot in the Caribbean. This settlement, known as Vinland, was short-lived, abandoned after hostile encounters with indigenous peoples. And contrary to popular belief, they were not a homogeneous people. Their society was far more diverse than legend suggests. Genetic studies of Viking burial grounds have revealed surprising ancestry, including Middle Eastern, Slavic, and Celtic lineages. Viking culture itself was a tapestry woven from countless threads: pagan traditions, Christian influence, indigenous Sami practices. And while Viking warriors indeed celebrated valor in battle, they were equally bound by law, custom, and community ties. Insults could be avenged with blood, but so too could murder be settled with wergeld, a fine paid to the victim's family. Assemblies known as things allowed free men to vote on legal matters and resolve disputes. Even the infamous blood eagle, a supposed torture method, where a victim's ribs were split from the spine and their lungs pulled out to resemble wings, is likely an invention of medieval Christian chroniclers. Its people were warriors and poets, slavers and traders, brutal raiders and visionary explorers, fathers and mothers, farmers and fishermen, lovers and rivals. Their world was harsh, beautiful, and unrelenting, and it shaped a culture both violent and deeply communal. No archaeological evidence or reliable Norse source confirms it was ever practiced. In truth, the Viking Age was not an age of unrelenting horror, but of contradiction and complexity. Meat was a rare luxury, often salted or smoked for preservation. And yet, even in this struggle for sustenance, the Vikings found time for poetry, storytelling, and craft. The land was rugged, the winters cruel. Villages huddled between fjords and forests, their homes built of wood and earth, insulated with turf and moss. To understand the truth about the Vikings, you must see them not as monsters of myth, but as people. Life for the average Norseman was not spent on the deck of a longship, but in the quiet, grinding labor of survival. Inside, families gathered around a central hearth. Smoke clung to the rafters. Meals were simple: barley porridge, dried fish, sour milk. They lived not by the myths we inherited, but by the realities of their world. And the deeper you look, the stranger and more human their story becomes. Oral tradition was the lifeblood of Norse society. Before the sagas were written down, history and myth alike were carried in memory, passed from mouth to mouth. Tales of Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, Thor, the thunderer, Loki, the shape-shifting trickster. These were not just stories, but frameworks through which the Vikings understood fate, honor, and death. And death was never far. Fate was spun by the Norns, 3 shadowy sisters who wove the threads of every life.
Oh, man.
No man could escape his destiny, but he could choose to face it with courage. Infant mortality was high. Disease and famine claimed lives before old age. Accidents on sea and land were constant threats. Every community had a thing, an assembly of free men who gathered to decide disputes, enact laws, and punish criminals. Here speeches were made, oaths sworn, and judgments passed. The Vikings accepted this with a grim fatalism. To them, life's brevity made glory and memory all the more vital. Their wood carvings, jewelry, and weapons display a refinement that rivals any medieval culture. Built for speed, flexibility, and shallow water navigation.
Oh.
These vessels allowed the Vikings to strike without warning, vanish up rivers, or cross oceans.
Okay.
Intricate knotwork, animal motifs, and runic inscriptions adorned everything from ship prows to brooches. They believed in a pantheon of gods who walked among men in disguise, who meddled in mortal affairs. Though subject to male authority in certain matters, They could own property, divorce husbands, and reclaim dowries. Sleek, elegant, and seaworthy, they were as much symbols of status as instruments of war. They managed farms in their men's absence and could avenge slights against their family's honor. Contrary to modern portrayals of Vikings as chaotic savages, their society was governed by intricate codes of law and custom. While historical evidence is sparse, recent archaeological finds suggest that female warriors may indeed have existed. The grave of a high-ranking warrior buried with weapons in burqa, Sweden, long assumed male, was in fact revealed by DNA analysis in 2017 to be female. A murderer might pay Wergild blood money to the victim's family in lieu of vengeance. Punishments ranged from fines to exile, and only in the gravest cases, death. Even then, mercy was sometimes granted. Women in Viking society held greater rights than many of their medieval counterparts. Some sagas tell of shield maidens, women who fought alongside men in battle. And then there was their craftsmanship. Far from being crude barbarians, the Norse were master artisans. Their longships remain one of the greatest technological achievements of the early medieval world. The Gokstad and Oseberg ships, preserved in Norwegian burial mounds, are testaments to this craftsmanship. Yet even here, myth persists. The idea that Vikings lived to raid and conquer is a simplification. Truth is, the Viking expansion had many causes: economic, political, and environmental. This, combined with a fragmented political landscape and limited arable land, pushed ambitious men to seek fortune abroad. Trade routes opened by the Carolingian Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate offered new markets. The city of Dublin was founded by Vikings in 841 AD. Normandy, literally land of the Northmen, owes its name and heritage to them. There, in 911 AD, a Viking leader named Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king in exchange for protection against further raids. And the collapse of nearby kingdoms left rich, undefended monasteries and towns vulnerable. They established the city of Novgorod and eventually Kiev, laying the foundation for the medieval Russian state. A warming climate in the early medieval period made farming more viable in Scandinavia, increasing population. It was a slow, uneven transformation. As Norse kings converted to Christianity and centralized their power, raiding became politically untenable. New trade routes favored overland connections, and in time, the raiders' grandchildren became the rulers of the lands they once pillaged. What began as opportunistic raiding gradually transformed into conquest and settlement. Viking settlers established colonies across the British Isles, Ireland, northern France, and even parts of Eastern Europe. Sky, window, knife, egg, husband, anger, and berserk are all Viking gifts to our tongue. In the east, Vikings known as the Varangians traveled along the rivers of Russia, founding trade posts and forging alliances. Fierce and loyal, they were famed for their battle axes and devotion to their emperor. They guarded the imperial palace for centuries. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse mercenaries, even served the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. The Viking world was vast and interconnected, stretching from North America to the Caspian Sea, and with this reach came cultural exchange. Vikings adopted Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries, though often blending it with lingering pagan customs. A Christian cross might hang alongside Thor's hammer on a burial mound. Ancient gods gave way to new saints. Sacred groves were cleared for churches, and runestones bore both prayers and ancestral boasts. The end of the Viking Age did not come through defeat alone, but their legacy endured, not just in blood and bone, but in law, language, and legend. Today, countless words in English owe their origin to Old Norse, and the sagas once told around smoky hearths still inspire novels, films, and fantasies. The real Viking world was not one of horned helmets and cartoon brutality, but of poetry and pragmatism, blood and beauty, myth and memory. It was a world much like ours, complicated, flawed, and astonishing. Even now, more than 1,000 years after the last Viking ship sailed the North Sea, the world cannot let them go. They have become symbols, icons of rebellion, freedom, and untamed masculinity. Heavy metal album covers, sports team mascots, and blockbuster movies resurrect them as primal warriors, unconquerable and pure. Yet, as with so many cultural relics, these images have been warped, claimed by those who would twist history to serve their ends. In recent decades, Viking symbols have been co-opted by white nationalist and extremist groups, seeking to invoke a mythic, racially homogeneous past. Ancient runes and long-forgotten banners have appeared at hate rallies and on propaganda websites. Genetic studies reveal Middle Eastern, Celtic, and Asian ancestry woven through Norse family trees. Slavery was practiced, and war captives from as far as Ireland and Eastern Europe became part of Norse households. Multicultural contact wasn't an exception, it was the rule. It was a melting pot of peoples and traditions. Vikings traded with Arabs, Byzantines, and Slavs. To claim otherwise is not just dishonest. It robs history of its truth, of its complexity, and even the myths we inherited. The blood eagle, the berserker frenzy, the endless raiding, while rooted in fragments of truth, were shaped and exaggerated by those who feared them. Later, Victorian romantics revived the image as a symbol of northern valor and masculine might. And Hollywood gave them horned helmets and endless battle scenes because it made good cinema. Christian monks painted the Vikings as devils, agents of chaos sent by God's wrath. Yet the heart of the Viking story was always more human. They were not monsters, nor were they saints. They were people. They loved, laughed, mourned their dead, and argued over inheritance. They sang songs of the gods, of the sea, of the wind in the rigging, and the sun glinting off a sword blade. They made mistakes. They committed atrocities. They brokered peace. They built communities in strange lands and forged new identities. And in the end, like all things, their age passed. But their mark on history remains. The English language still carries their words. Modern law echoes the traditions of Norse things, where disputes were settled by assembly. The concept of trial by jury, of community decision-making, owes a debt to these northern farmers and warriors. Place names from York to Normandy to Dublin bear traces of their presence. Stories of Odin, Thor, and Loki still flicker in comics and novels, reborn in every generation. And their ships, those swift, narrow, dragon-headed marvels, remain one of the most recognizable icons of medieval ingenuity. A scrap of cloth, a shard of pottery, a rune-carved stone. Each discovery strips away the layers of myth and brings us closer to the people beneath the legend. Today, historians and archaeologists continue to unearth fragments of their world. People who believed that a good death was one faced with courage, who trusted that the dead might dine in Valhalla or pass into darkness, who raised stones so their names would not be forgotten. And perhaps that is the final truth of the Vikings. Not their savagery, not their conquests, but their hunger for immortality. Not in the afterlife alone,